Welcome to Sports Spectrum, the sports and faith podcast that brings Jesus back into the conversation. Here's your host, Jason Romano.
Welcome, everyone, to Sports Spectrum. I am Jason Romano. Very excited for our guest today, Randy Rich, the former NFL player. He has a fantastic story. Before we get to Randy Rich, though, I want to tell you and continue to tell you about the initiative that we're doing over these past 30 days, starting October 14th, ending November 14th, with Express Feedback for Good. It's an initiative to generate up to $50,000 for us here at Sports Spectrum. And they are a platform, Express Feedback for Good, for individuals to support organizations that they care about. Simply leaving an opinion, that's what you're doing. Leaving an opinion creates funding for Sports Spectrum, and sharing more opinions creates more funding. It's that simple. It costs you exactly $0. It's free. And all it takes is maybe a minute each day for the next 30 days. That's it. So we'd love to have you consider partnering with us. No gimmicks here. Your personal information is kept confidential, and you'll only be contacted in relation to the program. Sign up today at sportspectrum.com or by simply texting the letters EFG to 31996. Pleased to have Randy Rich today joining us here on Sports Spectrum. Randy played in the NFL from 1977 to 1979, a short career there. He played with the Lions, the Broncos, the Raiders, and the Browns. And after his short career, Randy went into ministry and currently is the vice president of the Dare to Dream program at K-Love and Air1. If you know K-Love, they're that Christian radio station that's pretty much all over the country. I know we have one here in the Hartford, Connecticut area. Randy's also an author. He wrote the book, Nothing Wasted, Learning to Believe You Are Enough in a World of Labels. Randy has lived quite the life, and he talks about it here on the podcast, a life that's full of ministry, full of football, and certainly full of faith. And he's a great encourager when you talk to him. You can really hear this dude kind of has like that pastoral, loving parenting type of vibe to him. And I really enjoyed talking to Randy. And we actually spent a lot of time talking before and after our taping as well. Just full of wisdom. Lots of good stuff here. Take a listen to Randy Rich from K-Love and Air1, former NFL player, here on Sports Spectrum's podcast. Randy, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jason. Good to be with you.
It's great to have you here, Randy. And I loved the connection that we made because it started with a DM from a couple people on Twitter who were like, you have to talk to Randy if you haven't had him on the podcast. He works in ministry and he's a former NFL player. And I'm like, why don't I know this, Randy? So I'm glad that we got to connect here. Let's start before we go back in time, because I could talk football all day, and I love the era that you played in the late 70s, early 80s. But let's talk about now and the ministry that you're in, Vice President, Dare to Dream program, working with K-Love and Air1. We have a K-Love station here in Connecticut that's on all the time in our household where I live. So tell us about your role and kind of what that entails.
Well, for those that might not know about K-Love and Air1, we're the largest music network in the world. We have about 950 physical radio stations around the United States, and then pretty popular on the URL band in terms of internationally. The Dare to Dream program was birthed about 4 years ago after visiting with our then CEO, Mike Novak, of how we could reach a demographic that we're not reaching through the airwaves. And let's just face it, radio is a great opportunity to reach people. It can go with a person anytime, 24/7, but it also targets certain demographics. And so I really have a heart for young people. I had a challenging childhood myself, and a good family, but some real challenges. And so our program is designed to deal with the emotional and social side of a student in a world that they're living in, full of labels and and all sorts of expectations on their life that makes it really difficult for teachers in the classroom to teach core curriculum items, which they're commissioned to do. So the Dare to Dream program centers in and around the circle of trust that kids put in their circle, and how choices today will impact their life tomorrow.
I love that. I love that. Yeah. And I love what K-Love's about. Even just, there's so many different aspects of different media companies. And we had Scott Smith on from K-Love, probably about 6 months ago or so. And Scott was fantastic. He's actually one of our more listened to podcasts that we've had this year. I don't tell him that because we don't want it to go to his head. Right, Randy?
Well, that's okay, man. He's a good guy, and he's pretty good at it too. He knows how to talk behind that mic.
Absolutely. And he's a big sports guy, and we had a great conversation. So Tell me a little bit about ministry, and when, in your eyes, ministry is becoming something that you want to kind of delve into. I want to talk the football side in a minute, and these may intersect too. But the ministry, why and how, maybe a little background on the idea of going into ministry.
Well, I think we're all in ministry, Jason. I think once a person comes to realize through faith and belief in God, he calls us into a work. That work is to share the good news. And man, any one of us can do that anywhere. And so it doesn't, quote unquote, have to be a ministry. But I knew way back when I was involved with football, I worked with a program called Sports World Ministries in the off season. And we went into schools and shared stories in a creative way, because you couldn't preach the gospel. But so we did that, and that's really when I felt a real call in my life, which led me to be involved in a radio station in New Mexico, Albuquerque, that was at the time the oldest, it still is, the oldest contemporary Christian music station in the country, and really used that as a platform to reach young people. And I read a stat that really weighs heavy on my mind even to this day, and it was a couple of years old, but so it might have even changed now. But they said by the time a student reaches the 8th grade, about 82% of their value system is set in place. That means their morality, their integrity, all the important values of life are pretty well formed by the time they're in 8th grade. Wow.
Yeah.
And I thought, man, what's going on? That's that group, Jason, that a lot of people say, oh, we can't wait till they get through that phase of life. Well, kids don't get through anything. They grow into somebody as they journey in life. And so for me, it was a great opportunity to reach kids. And ministry has been a part of my life ever since football. God, I know, gave me that platform for a reason, and it was not for my glory or honor, because certainly you have to dig deep to find out who I was and who I played for. But the fact that I'm kind of proof that God has a sense of humor, that he could take any situation and for his cause and make it work. And so anyway, ever since I became a believer, I just knew that I'd be doing something in what would be called a vocation, full-time ministry.
Randy Rich is our guest here on Sports Spectrum. You played in the NFL, and we'll talk about that little NFL journey in a minute, but I want to go back even further because you wrote a book called Nothing Wasted, Learning to Believe You Are Enough in a World of Labels. So let's go back and tell us about growing up before the NFL came calling. You said you had it prior to our taping. You said you had a tough time growing up. It wasn't the easiest childhood for you. So share a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I want to be careful here because, man, my siblings we are so close and so tight knit, but it's no secret. My mom and dad had a pretty tough marriage. My dad was a truck driver and liked to drink a lot, and my mom was working a full-time job, and she did shift work. So they were gone a lot, but there was a lot of anger and violence in our home. Not always, but boy, when it hit hard. And so we kind of grew up in a situation where if we got in trouble, we were sent out to the mulberry tree and had to cut our own switch,
yeah.
so to speak. And if it wasn't big enough, you had to go up and cut another one. So it was pretty tough. And I was the youngest of 6 kids, and athletics played a big part. My mom played professional fast pitch ball in 1937, 38, and 39, 40.
Okay.
And she was an all-star pitcher for the Hollywood Curlers. And so she was the athletic one, and she really was the one that pushed the kids into sports. And all my siblings were pretty athletic, and I just happened to be the youngest and benefited from all of them and their leading. And God opened up opportunities for me that always seemed to be impossible, but that's how God loves to work. He likes to take that which is impossible, make it possible.
Yeah. Not
for you, not for me, but for him, for his glory and honor. And I don't want to sound like he's a selfish God. No, but he's got a plan, and his plan is to draw all people unto himself, and he uses all kinds of situations and circumstances to do that.
Absolutely. And when I was looking through the book, you said in Nothing Wasted that you spent a lot of your life insecure. So share a little bit more of that insecurity that you felt. Maybe it stemmed from being in the household that you grew up in, and maybe that's something else that you were dealing with. But what did you mean by that, and kind of what that difficult wrestling with insecurity was like for you?
Yeah. So, think about a scenario where when somebody in your home drinks and they come home and you're not really sure how they're going to be treating you, there's a certain amount of fear that was all, kind of permeated many times. And so I learned at a very early age that anger was a pretty neat response emotion to deal with the lack of security in my life. And so I used anger many times to control an uncontrollable situation, if that sounds or makes sense.
Sure.
But so I grew up that way, very, angry, and then I loved football, and from a very early time on, I was too small and too short and too white and too slow to really do much, and yet God continued to push me forward in that, to the degree of going on and playing in college and then also in the NFL. And that's where the book really talks about there's not one thing wasted in your life on this journey if we continue to trust God. And it was through that hardship of growing up in that family that I think really contributed to being a very tenacious player on the field. I mean, I'm 5'9", I weighed 172 pounds, dripping wet when I played, but I loved taking on 265-pound pulling guards. I just loved it, and I loved to hit, and it was just like I took all my anger and aggression out on the football field. And guess what? That works good on the football field.
Yeah,
doesn't do well for you in personal relationships, but it certainly was so that's where I would say, the situation I had with my family really wasn't wasted. God used that to really, develop and create in me this tenacity of setting a goal and driving forward until that was accomplished. Mm-hmm. And so I love the game of football, so I studied it. Coaches love that. They love a smart player. And, I was aggressive, so I would jump to the front of the line every time I could. So, that was just the way it all unfolded. So that's just one aspect of what the title of the book means, Nothing Wasted. Mm. Because in God's economy, he says, he causes all things to work together for the good of those in Christ Jesus. And so if that's true, there's not one situation, one disappointment, one hardship that a person goes through that goes wasted if you turn and put your faith and trust in the Lord, because he's going to see you through it.
Yeah, that's really good. How does a 5'9", 172-pound kid make it to the NFL, Randy? How does that happen?
I'm going to tell you what, by the grace of God, honestly, because you're right. I tell you, it doesn't make sense. Jason, I went to the University of New Mexico, and a lot of colleges passed me up because I was too small. And I became the first freshman at New Mexico to start and play on the defense in the secondary, and played all 4 years there. And then I was told I was going to be drafted by the Broncos, and they passed me up because I think they saw that they could, and then signed me as a free agent. I was one of 28 defensive backs that was invited to camp, and ended up making it down to 7, and played 2 years with the Broncos, 2 years with the Cleveland Browns, and a crazy year in between Detroit and the Oakland Raiders. But again, every time I was in the NFL, every single year I had a brand new position coach. And I am sure they assessed their roster, and they looked, at me and said, "What's this little guy doing here?" And,
Right.
How do we get rid of this guy? And I got to tell you, Jason, I saw a lot of, perfect physique defensive backs, 6'1", 191-pound guys, run a 4.5, come in, and I'm looking and thinking, okay, my number's up. But guess what? They didn't have the heart, they didn't have the connectivity or whatever. And I just saw that situation. I could tell you story after story where it looked like the number was on the wall, but something would happen. And a player would walk out. A starter said, "I want to be traded." Something would happen that would open up that position for me, and I'd make the team. Wow. So it was quite interesting. And that's really what we started out to do in writing this book, even before the title, was that a couple friends of mine said, "You've got to write all the funny stories and all the things that God did for you in the NFL." And that might be another book later on. But when we started writing this book, very, very quickly, that was not what the Lord wanted to do. He wanted it to go in a different direction. And that's why the book is written in a way for someone to be self-reflective after each chapter. There are questions each one of us need to answer that I think is important in terms of our growth and understanding of this love that God, never-ending love that God has towards us, and a heart of reconciliation and restoration for us through any circumstance and situation we've come through.
We'll continue our conversation with Randy Rich in just a moment, but want to take a second to remind you about Express Feedback for Good. We launched this program on October 14th. It runs for 30 days. It's not too late to get involved. We'd love to have you partner with us and be a part of what we're doing here with Express Feedback for Good. And what they do is they allow people like yourself to support causes that they care about by sharing feedback on the brands that they interact with. It's totally free. And as a fan of Sports Spectrum, you can join Express Feedback for Good and share that feedback on brands that matter to you. Each time you give a piece of feedback, it takes less than a minute. Your opinion helps create financial impact for Sports Spectrum. It's really that easy. And we're hoping, we're praying here that $50,000 could be the number. That's our goal of funding for Sports Spectrum through this initiative with Express Feedback for Good. All you have to do, again, it's totally free. Your personal information is kept confidential. And all you have to do is either go to sportspectrum.com, our website, to sign up, or simply text the letters EFG right now to 31996. EFG to 31996. I promise you it's free. It's confidential. There's no gimmicks here. Trust me on this. All we're looking for is your feedback. That's it. And together, we can create up to $50,000 of funding for Sports Spectrum. That's the goal. And of course, we'll use that funding to continue spreading the gospel through the lens of sports. Let's get back to our conversation with Randy Rich here on Sports Spectrum's podcast. Before I ask you about your faith journey and sort of where Christ became Lord of your life, I want to ask a football question because I'm just a football junkie in a lot of ways. I'm a historical guy. I love the history of the game. I love the era that you played in the late 70s. Football was a interesting time during those years with the Steelers and the Cowboys and the Broncos and the Raiders and just these sort of dominant teams. And it was a lot of fun. It's kind of where I was 5 years old, I guess, in 1978, just where football kind of started to take shape for this very young boy in myself. So tell me about, let's go to the Super Bowl XII. And I'm a Cowboys fan, and you know this.
Yeah.
We've talked about this. I don't remember Super Bowl XII. My earliest memory is a few years later. But I know in Cowboy history, that's a big deal for Dallas because of that game and the Doomsday defense. But you were a member of the Broncos, so you were on the other side. I believe this was the first indoor Super Bowl in the history of the NFL at the Superdome in New Orleans. So the game, I'm sure, wasn't a great memory for you, but the experience of playing in a Super Bowl, what stands out when I bring up Super Bowl XII to you?
Well, it was a great experience. It's what 10 million little boys dream about, right? You were 5 years old. You probably, had some sort of thought or, premonition of what it would be like. And it was a dream come true. And Jason, this is a great part of the story because this kind of gives you an idea of what I was just saying about how God makes a way. Yeah, let's back up before Super Bowl XII, just for a minute, okay? Mm-hmm. I was playing for the Detroit Lions earlier that season, and I was doing really pretty well. But what had happened is right at the end of preseason, it looked like I was going to make the team for Detroit, and all the news guys came around because I was a free agent. They said, they were asking all kinds of questions because I had done really, really well. Matter of fact, I had started the last preseason game as a strong safety in front of Charlie West. And I later found out it was because they wanted to prove to management that I could play. Anyway, long story is this. About the third, so the reporters are in the locker room and they said, Randy, what are your chances? What do you think of this? What you think you're going to make it? You're going to think you're going to. And here's what I said. I said, I don't know, guys. I said, man, listen, if God wants me here, I'll be here. That's all I know.
Yeah.
Next day, newspaper article. Rich says, if God wants him here, he'll be here. Well, Russ Thomas, the general manager at the time, was not a follower of Christ. Was a little bit mad about that. And I found out later from my coaching staff, didn't know this up until later, that they had gone into a meeting and fought to keep me when he wanted to get rid of me.
Wow.
And so what had happened is he was just waiting for me to make a big mistake, which happened in the third game of the season. I had a pretty bad game. He cut me. He said, he's gone. He's out of here. And Joe Reed was a quarterback for the Lions at that time, met me in the parking lot on the day off and when I was going to take my playbook in. And he said, what are you doing here? And I said, well, I've been released, Joe. And he said, what? And we talked for a minute. Then he laughed and he said, Randy, don't worry about it. Detroit cuts somebody every year that ends up going to the Super Bowl. You'll probably be in the Super Bowl this year. And we laughed. Well, a few weeks later, the Broncos called me back up and said, hey, we want you back to the team. So I went back to Denver, and that was the magic year with Red Miller. And I before I'd played with John Ralston. And so now Red Miller's the coach. And now I get to the Super Bowl. And so here's answering your question. I'm sorry, but I had to tell a little bit of that story.
Please.
That's kind of funny.
That's great.
So I'm every day, we had media day where you had to sit around this little round table with your a little name tag there that said who you were, and you had to be available to the media. So I'm sitting there, and nobody cares about me. Somebody from Detroit comes and identifies me, and he says a few things, and I say a few things. But then this gal from, I think, the Washington Post or someplace like that, she says, can I sit down? I said, sure. And I said, she said, so Randy, tell me, you're a Christian, right? And I said, yes, ma'am. And she said, so I understand there's a lot of Christians on the Denver Bronco team. And I said, yes, ma'am, there are. And she goes, I think there's a lot of Christians, I think, on the Dallas Cowboys. And I said, yeah, I think so too. And she goes, who does God want to win this game?
The worst
Jason,
question, man.
23-year-old guy. I'm just a young guy.
Yeah.
And I looked at her, and this is where I love where God shows up. I looked at her and I said, and I don't remember her name. I said, ma'am, I don't think God really cares who wins this game, but I do know one thing. in the winning and the losing, he's going to be glorified. She shut up her book, got up, and walked away. I thought, oh boy, I blew my big chance for an article.
Well, what were they expecting you to say? Well, Denver's going to win by 40 points.
She wanted me to stir the pot, you know?
Exactly. No, that's
I'm positive of that. And you know what? That is what happened. Life is so, here, especially in this country, it's all about competing and doing and all this. And I think about it, I'm only one of a couple of thousand players in the whole world that's had a chance to play in the Super Bowl.
Yep.
Would we have liked to have won? Absolutely. It's why you play the game, keep score. But man, to be there, we could start rattling off a bunch of names of people, O.J. Simpson, Earl Campbell. We could go right down the list of guys that never got there.
Yeah.
And so.
Dan Fouts.
Yeah.
Another guy that comes to mind. Yeah.
Yeah. So the memory is all about the team. Matter of fact, I'm just going to do this because it's right here.
Yeah.
I don't know. Can you see that?
I can see it, yeah. For those that are watching the video, I can see it. That's a picture from that Super Bowl. Looks like a practice, right?
Yeah, this is the practice before the game.
Oh, wow.
That's Red Miller in the middle.
Yep.
I think I'm over here somewhere.
Okay.
But
Red Miller was the head coach of the Broncos, right?
Yeah, Red Miller. That's what the game was all about.
Yeah.
All those guys.
That's awesome.
And all those guys. When people ask me, what do you miss about playing football? I said, well, according to my back and shoulder, I don't really miss a whole lot. But what I do miss is the camaraderie in the locker room.
Yeah.
And a matter of fact, just this last summer, we had a Super Bowl. We had an Orange Crush defense reunion.
I was going to ask you about that. What was that experience like?
Oh, man. Let me tell you what, Jason. We were up in the mountains of Colorado, and there's only 15 guys left, and a couple of coaches, and we had 4 days up there. We just had a blast telling stories. Guys that you work with, Tom Jackson, Steve Foley, one of my dearest friends, and guys came from all over the country to meet and just reminisce, and everybody agrees. Nobody's talking about how good they were or any of that. Who was the starter, who wasn't. But it was all, we were all part of something very unique and special called the Orange Crush defense, and it's all about the stories. So it was great.
Well, I want to ask you for some more stories in a second, because I think stories are what make the podcast great. And I'm talking about football stories, but I want to hear your story. So in all of this discussion that we've had so far, 20 minutes or so into the podcast, I haven't heard your faith testimony yet. So tell us about that. Tell us when Christ became real to you, when you asked him into your life, and when God got a hold of you, Randy Rich.
Yeah. Thanks, Jason. I love to tell the story. It's a great one, as is every story of conversion.
Absolutely.
But I was in high school, and my athletic director came up to me and said, do you want to go to an FCA conference? And I said, what's an FCA? And he said, Fellowship of Christian Athletes Conference. I said, okay, what is that? And he said, hey, look, it's where a bunch of high school guys, over 1,000, are going to gather together over in Santa Barbara, California. I lived in Bakersfield. And for a whole week, you're going to hear stories about pro football players and pro athletes, and strongest man in the world, Paul Anderson's going to be there. And guess what, Randy? There's a judge in town who's paid your way to go. And I said, it's free? He said, yeah. I said, okay, I'm in. And I went there. I went there for two reasons. It was free. We didn't have a lot of money, my family. Number two, I was promised to meet pro football players and be a high school player. That's what you want to do. So I went over there, and I was like a fish out of water, because most of those kids, there's 1,200 young men from high schools all over the western part of the United States that showed up. Everybody's talking about being a Christian and what it's like and this and that. And I'm just I thought Christianity was like another religion, like Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian. I didn't even know the difference.
Right.
And so I'm hearing all these stories and I'm listening to all these people. And last night comes, and the speaker is Don Cockcroft. And Don Cockcroft
I remember
was
him.
the punter, the punter and the kicker for the Cleveland Browns.
That's right.
And he stood up and he spoke. And I'm going to tell you, Jason, 1,200 kids there. I felt like Don was speaking right to me.
Wow.
And man, I went back up to my room by myself, and because I was embarrassed, because I felt like, again, I didn't know what everybody was talking about, I must not be good enough or whatever, but he made sense to me. Went back into my room, prayed to receive Christ, had a peace that came about me. I went on to go to the University of Mexico, was discipled there, and by two great men, Dan Johnston and Jay Kalina, and went on to grow in my faith. Fast forward in my travels in the NFL, I end up in Cleveland. And there was a running back by the name of Calvin Hill. You remember him?
Sure.
Cowboy fan? Yeah.
Absolutely. Grant Hill's dad.
Yeah. He was traded to the Cleveland Browns, and he was staying at the hotel I was at. And we saw each other, and he said, "Hey, do you have any interest in going to a Bible study?" I said, "Absolutely, I'm in." He goes, "Meet me here in 15 minutes, we'll go." So we go, we drive over, knock on the door. Who opens that door but Don Cockcroft?
Wow.
And I don't know, I would have loved to have had a picture of my face, because it was like, what? That commercial? What? I walked in and sat down, and just before we got started, Don was leading it. He says, "Hey, what's your name again?" I said, "Randy." He says, "Why don't you stand up and share your testimony?" Wow. And I looked at him. I said, I'll be glad to, because he didn't know me from Adam. He really did.
Yeah.
And so I got up and I told him that story, what I just shared with you. And man, Don Cockcroft is just bawling. And he says, "I have to say something," after I was done talking. He said, "I remember that year I was not going to go to that conference because I did not believe I was living a very faithful life in Christ. I didn't feel worthy."
Wow.
And you know what? We all agreed, Jason, this is one of those monumental things that you look back and say, there's a crossroads in my life that I know God put a period on something. And that was this: we are never adequate. Matter of fact, Corinthians says you're foolish to consider anything coming from yourself. Your adequacy is in Christ Jesus. So we said, look, if God ever gives us a chance to share, we go and we take it, because it's not about us. Right. It's about him.
Yeah.
And to this day, Don Cockcroft's a dear friend of mine. And that's another one of those things that, hey, of all the things that could happen from a little high school senior in high school to one day go through all this stuff, who's too small, too short, too white, too slow, to be a defensive back in the NFL. And I say that respectfully, just sort of jokingly, but
sure.
To let it happened that I would end up in Cleveland, and come back together and really encourage my friend Don Cockcroft and others that, look, God in his ways would do that. That's pretty specific, man.
Yeah. I mean, listen, God sometimes works in say mysterious ways, but in kind of outside of the box ways, and some are clear ways. And when I just can't imagine your face when you're opening that door and there's Don Cockcroft and you're just like, what is happening right now?
Yeah. I didn't go, Don. I was stunned. It was like, I didn't even know he was still on the team. I didn't know.
Yes.
I just got there. I was just there getting my physical on the day off, and just met Calvin Hill. That's all I knew.
Right.
Anyway,
great story. I love that.
That's my story. And you know this, Jason. The conversion story is just the beginning, right?
Yes.
There are things that happen. Man, I went through a divorce in my life that was very defining. After 22 years of marriage, most painful thing, most regretful thing ever to happen in my life. So there are a lot of things that happen that even that, because I've come to know that God hates divorce.
Yeah.
Oh, but he loves the divorcee.
Yeah.
And so, there's all kinds of things that have happened on this journey. That's why I like to sign my little notes and letters, continuing the journey, Randy Rich, okay? Because that's what I'm doing.
That's good. That's good. As we get ready to close down, this has been a great conversation, Randy. Again, the book is called Nothing Wasted, Learning to Believe You Are Enough in a World of Labels. It's available on Amazon and everywhere books are found. So as you look back now, whether it's your athletic career, whether it's some of the lessons, the hard lessons, some of the things that you described that you went through over these past few years, what's the great lesson that you learned over all of these years now that you look back? You said you're 65 and sort of in the late third quarter, we'll say, of life.
No, I'm in the late fourth quarter, dude, I think.
What if God keeps you till you're 100? Then you're only in the third quarter.
That's true. Yeah,
but good. As you look back, you got a lot of wisdom now. What's the lesson, the big lesson that you take away from your life and the life that God has given you and the life that you've spent?
Well, my life verse is found in the book of Philippians. Mm-hmm. And Paul the Apostle, early on, right up front in chapter 1, verse 6 says this. Paul, who was the Pharisee of Pharisees, this guy knew everything. He says, I'm confident of one thing, that he who began a good work, he will perfect it until the day of Christ Jesus. And it simply means this to me. God starts the work, God perfects the work, God finishes the work. And my part in it is the mustard seed of faith. Mm. That if I have a faith in situations in my life that God is going to lead me, direct me, and guide me, then it becomes God's faith that engages my little bit of faith. And man, that's where God takes you on a journey, and you begin to see things happen in a way that might not always be pleasing, might not always be happy and jolly and everything, but he's going to take you, and listen, life is about ups and downs, and we have to know that. And I would also say this too, Jason, that, listen, I tell this to young men. Hey, ask yourself a question, because we're doers, we're hunters, we're providers, we're out there doing right. Ask yourself in critical situations, how big of a deal is this in the scope of eternity? Right. Yeah. How big of a deal is this? Like, with your kids, how big of a deal is it to put your stick in the mud and say, boom, 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 you're gonna da-da-da-da. How big of a deal is this? And I'm going to tell you, about 85 to 90% of the stuff that we make a big deal, it's not a big deal. Yeah. And so, and that's hard in the moment, though, isn't it? Isn't that hard? Because I'm in the middle of parenting a teenager right now, Randy, and everything is a big deal to a teenager. And it's easy as a parent to get caught up and think that everything is a big deal as well, when in the grand scheme, who cares, right? Exactly. Yeah. I listen, a guy that I've listened to, and you can listen to him on a on he's gone to be with the Lord, but his name is Dick Woodward. But he has 4 spiritual truths. He says this: I'm not, but he is. It simply means this life isn't about me, it's about the Lord. Number 2, I don't know how, but he knows how. Well, you think about that. Do you know how to parent a teenager? Don't think so. No, I don't. But he does. Yes. And then number 3, I don't want to. Ooh, these are the things that when God says you get to do this, and you go, I don't want to do that, Lord. I know, but I want to. So you do it. And then finally, I didn't, he did, because Christ is in me and I'm in him. Those are the things, I think, Jason, to me, the very simple truths that have to be practiced. And listen, man, we're going to learn. The battle's waging. I remember talking to a guy that mentored me one time, and I was sharing my frustrations about things that I didn't seem to overcome in my life, that I, as a Christian, as many years as I've been, should look different or be different. And he looked at me and he said this. Now listen to this. He said, Randy, did you think your flesh was getting better? And I said, well, Wayne Barber. I said, Wayne, I've been a believer for 22 years. He goes, listen, son. He said, the Bible teaches this, that our flesh is getting older, uglier, and wiser, and that's why we need to let Jesus be Jesus in us. Wow. Yeah. And I thought, Wow, that's so true. And so with that son of yours, Jason, I would just say, look,
Daughter.
as best you can.
It's a daughter. It's my little girl.
That's right. That's right. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
As best you can. Oh, boy. I got one more piece of advice because I raised 3 daughters, okay? And I'll stop here. I don't mean to be preaching, but if you're a father of daughters out there, you have to learn this. You have to learn to ask the question right up front with your daughter. Honey, is this something you need Dad to fix, or do you just need me to listen?
Yeah.
Because I'm going to tell you what, Jason, about 98% of it, they just want you to listen.
Yeah.
And I didn't learn that. I didn't learn that early on. And dude, hey, listen, I was a black and white guy in a house full of women, and there's a lot of gray area when you got a lot of women in the house, okay?
Yeah.
It's not black and white.
No, I understand. I'm just in a house with my wife and my daughter, so I'm outnumbered, 2 girls to 1 guy, and I'm just doing my best, and that's
Jason,
why.
Hey, learn to ask your wife that question, too. I promise you it'll change the dynamics in your home.
That's really good. Randy Rich, thanks so much for your time, man. Lots of great wisdom here. Your story is awesome, and I hope to meet you in person, give a handshake, a high five, maybe even a big bear hug, and just say thanks for being here. Really appreciate your time. Wish you nothing but the best. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Jason.
Great stuff there from Randy Rich, the former NFL player, vice president of the Dare to Dream program for the K-Love and Air1 radio networks. He's just full of wisdom, isn't he? I mean, what a great guy. I feel like I could sit with him for hours and ask one question and just listen to him pour out that wisdom, and man, I can apply it to my life. We actually did that a little bit after our taping. Randy was gracious enough to give me another 20, 30 minutes, and we just sat and talked. We talked about life. We talked about marriage. We talked about family. We talked about God. And I had just met this guy 5 minutes before we started taping, and all of a sudden I felt so comfortable around him. So such a good dude, and really grateful to have him here on Sports Spectrum's podcast. We're also thankful to you for listening. We really are, because without you, nobody hears these stories, nobody shares these stories, and we believe in these stories to help people begin or develop or enrich their relationship with God. And so thank you for being a part of this podcast and sharing it on your social media pages, texting a friend, a family member, multiple family members, and say, hey, check out this interview, check out this podcast. Maybe they're a Cleveland Browns fan. Maybe they're a Denver Broncos fan. Maybe they're a K-Love fan. Either way, we appreciate you sharing this interview and so many others that we do here at Sports Spectrum. One favor we have to ask for you is to check out our website. It's sportspectrum.com. You can bookmark it, make it a place that you visit every single day, whether it's on your mobile device or on your laptop or home computer. But check it out, sportspectrum.com. We have a daily devotional at 6 a.m. Eastern. We have content all day long, different articles, different stories on the intersection of sports and faith. And we have every podcast there. So if you just want to listen through the website to all of our old podcasts, you can do that. Or you can just go to wherever you listen to podcasts, whether it's Apple, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, iHeartRadio, wherever podcasts are found, you can subscribe and listen to every episode of Sports Spectrum. We really appreciate you guys. We love you guys. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time with a brand new episode here at Sports Spectrum. Have a great rest of your day.